Hey everyone, welcome to our Bible study tonight. My name is Brian. I serve as the lead minister here at Westside Church of Christ, and I'm so thankful to be able to spend some time with you tonight. If you have a Bible close by, do me a favor and turn to the book of Joshua, and you can look for chapter 2. We are doing a series right now called The Faith of the Outsider, which is the title of a book by Frank Anthony Spina, and he tells the remarkable story of some of the people in the Bible that are easy to overlook. And a lot of the Bible stories that we have and the ones that we preach about and do VBS, curriculums based off of, there's always this hero of the story, someone super famous, strong or powerful like King David or Elijah or Peter or Paul. But in the background, there's sometimes these extras as well. Like in the movies, there's the main characters and then there's the extras who kind of, fill out the rest of the movie or maybe supporting actors. In the Bible, there is one chosen people, one chosen nation, Israel, in the Old Testament. And even though God chose them, God still used some of those extras or some of those supporting actors or actresses in some really incredible ways. And sometimes it's the outsiders that keep God's mission on track, even more so than the insiders, the Israelites that God has specifically chosen. The point of highlighting the important role that outsiders play in the Bible is to be an encouragement to all of us who are here living as disciples of Jesus in the year 2021 who don't always feel like we are the star of the show. For all of those Christians who love God and want to serve Him, but just don't feel like they're the kind of person to get up and preach in front of a crowd or lead in a public way, God still has a great purpose for you, even if you feel like you don't fit the traditional role of a leader or an insider. God wants to use you as well. So we've been looking at several of these stories of outsiders that God uses in these powerful ways to be a blessing to their community, to their towns, and really, eventually, to the whole world. Tonight, we get to do two stories. It's really the story of two different people, an insider and an outsider. And they're linked by this pretty famous story in the Bible about a fortified city that gets destroyed during the conquest in the book of Joshua. The insider that we're going to talk about might actually be less famous or less well-known than the outsider. And what we're going to see is that in this story, the person who should have been an insider becomes an outsider who is rejected and punished by God. And the person who starts off as an outsider who perhaps deserved punishment or accountability from God, they are elevated, they play an important role, they end up being included in the people of God and honored by being mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus. So the two people that we're going to talk about tonight, the insider is a man named Achan, and his story is in Joshua chapter 7, and the outsider is a woman named Rahab, and her story is told in Joshua chapter 2. And in between those, Joshua 2 and Joshua 7, is the story of the fall of Jericho, that fortified city where Israel came in, and instead of taking it over with like this strategic battle plan, God converted the army of Israel temporarily into like this marching band where they walked around the city over and over and over. And God caused the wall to fall, and God gave the people of Israel the victory. So Rahab and Achan's story, Rahab is right before the fall of Jericho and Achan is right after. And so they're linked by this story of God giving victory to His people. So I want to just try and explain how vastly different these two characters are. Rahab is the ultimate outsider. She ends up being elevated and included. Achan is the ultimate insider. He ends up being rejected, excluded, and spoiler alert, by the end of the story, he and his entire family are killed by God because of their sin. It's this dramatic role reversal, and it highlights the way that sometimes those that we consider to be good people on the inside lose their status before God. And sometimes those that we think, oh, there's no way God would ever allow them to come into the community of faith. There's no way that they could be accepted. Sometimes they are the ones that God chooses to play the most important role in the story. And we just need to be aware of the way that when we draw black and white lines, sometimes God is willing to cross over those. So it's an interesting story, interesting theme, and I hope that by the end of this you are encouraged by this story. So let's start by talking about Rahab, who is the outsider in this story. The first thing you need to know about Rahab is that she was not an Israelite. She was from the city of Jericho, the city that Israel was about to destroy completely. So she is culturally, religiously, ethnically an outsider. She's a Canaanite who resides as a native of that land. So she's a Canaanite woman, a foreign woman. So already from Israel's perspective, she has a couple strikes against her that make her an outsider as a Canaanite woman. Not only is she a Canaanite woman, she is a Canaanite female prostitute. So by virtue of her occupation, she's even lower than before. And even among prostitutes, they had different classes for them. Some were respected a little bit more than others because they were involved in religious ceremonies, religious context, which I know seems really bizarre now. And others basically were sort of like the more shameful kind, where there was nothing really even remotely redeeming about their work. And as you might expect, Rahab was in that lower status. Like she wasn't involved in anything, religious. It was just she was a common, shameful prostitute. The Bible tells us that detail, so we know just how much of an outsider she really is. Foreign, female, prostitute, and the most shameful kind of that. In his book, The Faith of the Outsider, Frank Anthony Spina has a couple of pages in there that talk about Rahab's name. And he goes into way more detail than I would like to in this study, but suffice it to say that her name has this promiscuous innuendo that's part of it, and it relates to her profession as a prostitute. Her name is like this painful reminder of her past and all of the ways that she has messed up and all the reasons why she is not valued in her society. So her name is this sort of painful reminder of how far she has sunk down. The dramatic reversal that she experiences, though, is that by the end of the story, she is not this lowest of the low outsider, but she is actually included in the nation of Israel. And in Matthew chapter 1, the Bible elevates Rahab from this lowest of low positions, and it raises her back up to mention that Rahab, this foreign female prostitute, ultimate outsider, was actually the great-great-grandmother of King David. So this is a dramatic role reversal, and we'll see really the key to that change from her past to her future involved her quick thinking to protect the men of Israel, but more importantly, her confession in the goodness of God, the strength of God, and she was willing to put her trust in the God of Israel. On the other hand, there's one other character that we're going to talk about, and it's this man named Achan. Achan had everything going for him to make him the ultimate insider. So instead of being a Canaanite woman, Achan is an Israelite man. So he already has sort of a step up compared to Rahab. And he comes from like the perfect family, like a very honorable family. In the beginning of Joshua chapter 7, it kind of gives us his family tree a little bit. We see that he's a descendant of Judah. And if you remember our last class, when Jacob, who is Judah's father, blessed all of Jacob's 12 sons, when he came to Judah, he said, Judah, you are going to be the one that all of your brothers bow down to. And you're going to hold the scepter, which represents the ruling power, until the Messiah comes to take that scepter from you, and all nations on earth will bow down to him. So Judah and his family would be the rulers, would be the kings. Achan is an Israelite man who is a descendant of this kingly ruling tribe of Judah. So he has a lot going for him. Now, one of the things you might not know about Achan is that he actually has another name that he's referred to when this story is sort of mentioned in 1 Chronicles chapter 2, verse 7. And his name, and especially that other name that he's referred to as in 1 Chronicles 2, means trouble. Trouble. Rahab's name had to do with her past, a painful reminder of where she had come from. Achan's name is a painful prediction of his future, and it shows sort of what he has in store for him coming up because of his own sin, his own poor choices. By the end of the story, Achan, who is this ultimate insider, is rejected by God, punished by Israel, and the sentence is death. And the transformation that occurs there, the role reversal that occurs there, has everything to do with him betraying God's commands. I'll tell a little bit more of that. But because he violated the law, because he violated the covenant, he was punished in a very harsh way. Achan doesn't really have much of a legacy. People don't do VBS stories about him. He's not really celebrated. You know, Achan isn't a very popular name the way that other heroes of the Bible have a lot of people named after them, like David and Elijah and people like that. He doesn't really have much of a legacy because he kind of blew it. He sinned in a very spectacular way. He was punished, and that was sort of the end of his family. So we have the outsider who ends up becoming an insider who is celebrated, and we have an insider who completely throws it all away and really fades into obscurity. So I'm going to let Frank Anthony Spina really share about the importance of these two stories and how they're linked together by that story of the fall of Jericho. So this is a quote from his book. "The importance of this text is that the community of faith must be constantly aware that outsiders are only a confession away from being included, while insiders are only a violation away, when it is a violation of Achan's magnitude, from being excluded." So what I think that means is that God does have a chosen people. There are insiders and there are outsiders. But sometimes those outsiders become insiders by the virtue of their repentance and their confession and their proclamation of faith. And sometimes the insiders become outsiders because they sort of drift away from their first love and their commitment to their relationship to God. So it is not our past sins, our past condition, or even our present status, but it's really our ongoing faithfulness to God and His laws that determines our standing before God. For those of us who are part of a community of faith that we do proclaim to be Christians, we can't just sit back and say, oh, well, because I consider myself a Christian, God is going to approve of everything I do, and He will always accept me even when I make terrible choices. It's a reminder that our standing before God requires ongoing faithfulness. And for those of us who are on the inside looking out at our world, there can maybe be a temptation to say, well, they out there in the world are the problem, and they're evil, and God has rejected them, and God has condemned them, and there is really no hope because their hearts are so full of evil all the time. And this is a reminder to us that even those like Rahab, who we would maybe consider to be the lowest of low, like the farthest from God, even they are right on the cusp of being included. It's possible for them as well to not only be part of the community of faith, but to really play an active and vibrant role in it. So there's sort of the dual reminders there for those on the inside and those on the outside. There's both hope for those on the outside and a pretty stern warning for those on the inside as well. So let's talk a little bit more about each of these stories. Joshua was the successor to Moses, and it was his responsibility to lead the people of Israel, who had been wandering in the desert in between Egypt and Canaan, the promised land. It was now up to Joshua to lead the people across the Jordan River and to go take the land. Now, the problem is that land was not a vacant lot. It was not uninhabited. In fact, there were tons of nations and cities, some of which were very fortified, already there. So this was not oh, here's the keys to your new house. It was, here's a sword, go kick everyone out, and then you guys can live there. So there is a conquest to be had, and Jericho is the first fight along the way, more or less. It's the very first major obstacle. So Joshua sends spies into this fortified city of Jericho, and the spies, without any explanation, decide to go to Rahab's house, who was a prostitute. Like, that was, for one reason or another, just where they went. The Bible doesn't tell us why they chose there. Doesn't really seem too concerned with it. But the spies are staying in the home of Rahab the prostitute. Somehow, again, we don't get the details, the king of Jericho finds out about this, and he starts to send his soldiers to go look for these spies. He's told, the spies are here, they're going to come attack us, conquer us, we got to go catch these spies and thwart their plans. So the king sends his soldiers to Rahab's house to sort of interrogate her. And she is so quick on her feet. Like, she kind of explains it away and says, yeah, they came here. I didn't know where they came from. Look, they ran that way, or maybe it was that way. If you guys go now, maybe you can catch them. And these soldiers don't really seem too bright because they don't actually search her house. And even though she said, I don't know where they went, but you should go catch them, like, they didn't know which way to run to go look for these guys. They're like, oh, you're right, we better go right now. So they're not the brightest crayon in the box. They leave without ever really searching her house, and she sort of outwits these soldiers. So again, we might consider her pretty low, but she's already proving that she's pretty shrewd, pretty quick on her feet. But what happens after that is really where we see Rahab's faith. And this is really the basis for the dramatic transformation that she's going to experience. So the spies are hiding in her roof when the soldiers are there. After they leave to go look for these spies, Rahab has a heart-to-heart with these two men of Israel who are really at Rahab's mercy at this point. So in Joshua chapter 2, verse 8, the Bible talks about what happens next. Before the spies lay down for the night to go to sleep, she went up on the roof and said to them, I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea, or really the Sea of Reeds, for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the two kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below. Wow, that is quite the theological explanation or discourse from someone who is like this lowest of low prostitute, wouldn't you say? She is remarkably well versed in not only the name of the God of Israel, but what he has accomplished by drying up, the water, the specific, the Sea of Reeds, talking about military victories over specific kings from other, on other parts of the country here. And she has a really good awareness of how all of these Canaanites are feeling, that they're, just struck with fear and panic. It says, their hearts had melted. How is it that she had such an awareness of what God was doing and what the people of Canaan were feeling like? In the book, Frank Anthony Spina kind of talks about how she really seems to be representing all of the Canaanites here. She's speaking to their mental state. She's aware of what God had been doing in the military victories. And she said, look, I know that the Lord has given you this land. She knew exactly what was happening, exactly what God was up to. And her confession at the end of that, for the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below. That phrase, God in heaven above and on earth below, is really only said by 3 people in the Bible. First, it's Moses, one of the most important leaders in Israel. Second is King Solomon, who's described as the wisest king Israel has had. And third is Rahab, the lowest of low prostitutes from the Canaanite city of Jericho. Moses, Solomon, and Rahab is a pretty unlikely trio of people. But just hear how the Bible is elevating her out of her lowliness, out of her obscurity, and it's elevating her and saying, look, she is in some pretty impressive company. Not bad for this foreign female prostitute that most other people would have overlooked and ignored. So she's well aware of what is happening. And then in verse 12, she makes a deal because she knows what's about to happen. She knows Israel's going to come and they are going to take over Jericho and no one will survive. And she makes a deal with these spies who are there. She understands she has the upper hand because she has protected them and has the ability to turn them over to the king and the soldiers really at any point. So in Joshua chapter 2, verse 12, she approaches them and says, "Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that you will show kindness to my family, because I have shown kindness to you. Give me a sure sign that you will spare the lives of my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and that you will save us from death." The men of Israel, the spies, know that, okay, well, we don't really have a choice here. Like, you've obviously saved our lives. And so they say, "Our lives for your lives," the men assured her. "If you don't tell what we are doing, we will treat you kindly and faithfully when the Lord gives us the land." Now, a couple of the words there in this passage are super important. And if you have listened to our Sunday morning sermons about discovering the heart of God and how God reveals 5 of his essential character traits to Moses in Exodus 34, then you'll know a couple of the words that Rahab uses here. She says to these spies that she has protected, even though she didn't have to, and is, talking with and helping them right now. She says that she has shown kindness to them. Kindness is the word chesed, or like God's unfailing love, which is one of the things that God says is part of his character, that he is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love, chesed, and faithfulness. So Rahab, is asking Israel to show her kindness, chesed, love, because she has already shown that chesed to these spies. And then she says, "Give me a sure or true or faithful sign that you will spare our lives." And that word, sure, true, faithful, is the Hebrew word emet, which is another one of the essential character traits of God that he reveals: abounding in love, abounding in faithfulness, or emet. So Rahab, this foreign female prostitute from the Canaanite city of Jericho, uses 2 of the words that God uses to describe his inner character, his essential qualities. And I want you to think about this. Joshua has 24 chapters. The vast majority of it is Israel annihilating people left and right. It is a book about military conquest and basically a complete and total annihilation of the people who lived there. Joshua is probably not the book of the Bible that you think about when you hear which book of the Bible is really all about love, because really this book is all about fighting. Rahab, the foreign female prostitute, is the only person in the book of Joshua to initiate chesed, to initiate love, to initiate kindness. There's this little glimmer of love, kindness, generosity against a backdrop of total military destruction. And the person who brings chesed, love, out from that backdrop of violence is this prostitute that would have gotten completely overlooked by everyone in Israel's society. It is Rahab who shows the heart of God in the book of Joshua. And I think that is so cool. So she says, "Look, I've shown you kindness. Give me a faithful, true sign that you will show me kindness." And at the end of that, they do say, "We will treat you kindly with chesed and faithfully with emet. You can count on us when the Lord gives us this land." So because of Rahab's confession, because of the love that she showed Israel, when the Israelites did enter into Jerusalem to conquer it and kill everyone who lived there and completely take it over, Rahab's family was spared, just like they had agreed to. They put this cord in her window, which symbolized the hope that she and her family had. That same cord probably would have been in her window for a long time, showing the kind of occupation that she was a prostitute. That red cord, the book that we've been using calls it sort of like the red cord district, because it would have told everyone passing by the kind of person that Rahab was. But that cord, which reminded her of her past, now became a symbol of her hope instead. And in Joshua chapter 6, verse 24, Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute with her family and all who belonged to her, because she hid the men Joshua had sent as spies to Jericho, and she lives among the Israelites to this day. Rahab, the ultimate outsider, through her confession of faith in God, her faithfulness to God's people, her trust in the Lord, the outsider became an insider. And in this story in Joshua chapter 2, I don't know, I can't remember if I mentioned this yet or not, Joshua is mentioned by name, Rahab is mentioned by name, but like nobody else in this story is really mentioned by name. The king of Jericho, you'd expect him to get some prominence in the story. They don't mention his name, they just call him the king. The men, the spies from Israel that came to scout out the land, you might expect them to be highlighted, but it doesn't tell us their names. The soldiers that came to look for these spies, we don't know their names. Rahab is mentioned by name along with Joshua in this story to show us the crucial role that this ultimate outsider was playing in God's mission in bringing Israel home to the promised land. The outsider plays a crucial role, becomes an insider, becomes an ancestor to Jesus himself, according to Matthew chapter 1. The outsider becomes the insider. And then at the end of the Jericho story, right after the fall of Jericho and Rahab and her family are spared, we immediately pivot to the ultimate insider, Achan. And as I mentioned, he came from the right family. He had a very honorable past. He was, an Israelite man. He had a lot going for them. But he sinned in a spectacular way. Not spectacularly good, but it was like a spectacle and everyone noticed. Here's what it says about Achan and his story in Joshua chapter 7, verse 1. But the Israelites, plural, the Israelites were unfaithful in regard to the devoted things. Achan, son of Carmi, the son of Zimri, the son of Zerah, of the tribe of Judah, took some of them. So the Lord's anger burned against Israel. Okay, and I want to highlight this just really quick. In this story, Achan is the one and only person who sins in this way. As they conquered these cities, God expected them to kill everyone, to kill everything, take everything that they plundered and destroy it by donating it to God. So they were not to keep anything for themselves, because God was reminding them, it's not your power that's making this happen, it's God's, so give it all to God. Achan is the only person who keeps some of the treasure for himself. And yet the Bible, when it talks about this sin, God is saying all of Israel has sinned in this way. Just like Rahab sort of symbolized or represented all of the Canaanites, Achan, even though he's one person, really represents all of Israel here. And so the Israelites were unfaithful, even though Achan was the only one who did that. So the Lord's anger burned against Israel, even though, again, it's only Achan who actually sinned. What happens in the rest of the story is that Israel has this next target in mind that they need to go capture, the next city on the map to go, conquer. And it's the city of Ai. It's literally A and then I, and that's how you spell it. So it's not that big. It's definitely not as impressive as Jericho. It's a lot smaller, and they send a small detachment of their army to go wipe it out because they know it's going to be a cakewalk. It's going to be super easy. Well, it wasn't super easy, and the reason being is that God wasn't with them as they went. Because of this sin, God was no longer blessing them with victory. And even though it should have been really easy, they were completely destroyed. Like the attack was an utter failure. Israel lost soldiers. They were forced to retreat. And then Israel started to respond the same way the Canaanites did when the Canaanites knew Israel was coming to take them over. In Joshua chapter 7, verse 5, kind of like the second part of it, it says, they chased the Israelites from the city gate as far as the stone quarries and struck them down on the slopes. At this, the hearts of the people melted in fear and became like water. Israel knew that God would give them the victory over the people living in the land. And the reality that they had faced such a, magnificent failure here was like earth-shattering for them. It caused them to panic because they're like, is God no longer with us? Is the whole plan going to fail? Is he rejecting us as a people? Like, why did we lose? We weren't supposed to lose. And their hearts just melted in fear. And that is exactly what Rahab said was happening to the Canaanites in Jericho. I know that the Lord has given you this land and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. And so now Israel, who is the chosen nation, they are acting like the Canaanites, the rejected nation. And we see this role reversal with Israel because someone in their midst violated the laws of God, and there were consequences for the whole nation because of the sin of that one man. So they sort of went through this grieving process. At this point, they didn't really know why God was against them, but they started to kind of go through this grieving process of bowing down and ripping clothes and dirt on their face. And God basically says, look, what are you doing? Like, get up. In chapter 7, verse 10, the Lord said to Joshua, stand up. What are you doing down on your face? Israel has sinned. Like, it's not a mystery. Israel has sinned. Again, everyone has sinned, even though it was one person. They have violated my covenant, which I commanded them to keep. They have taken some of the devoted things. They have stolen, they have lied, they have put them with their own possessions. And what happens after that is that the Lord tells them, get ready, because I'm going to reveal who it is. And there's this process of casting lots, and God reveals that it's someone from the tribe of Judah, someone from this particular family, and then it's Achan. And they confront Achan, and he confesses to us, yeah, I did it. Here's what I took. You can go find it in my tent, in my house, like look under the secret storage room in my garage or something like that. And they go, and sure enough, that's where it is. Because this sin was so serious, because God was so clear about this, and because God needed the people of Israel to understand the consequences of violating his covenant, Achan, the ultimate insider from the right family, from a man of honor, a man who would have been highly respected and valued on account of who his family was, he was punished severely. Israel was supposed to completely destroy everything and not keep anything of what they had taken over and conquered throughout this. And so God gave Achan the same punishment, essentially. Because Achan kept some, God inflicted the same punishment on him that they should have taken out on the land that they were taking over. So Achan and his entire family and all of his possessions were taken out into this valley, a valley called Trouble, and there he was stoned and burned and completely destroyed by the people of Israel. The ultimate insider sins in a dramatic way and becomes completely rejected and punished because of his sin. So this story, when you look at Rahab the outsider who becomes an insider and Achan the insider who becomes the outsider, it shows us there's this role reversal. Those who are insiders can't just sit back and rest on their laurels and say, well, God has accepted me, so now I can do whatever I want with no consequences. That's not how it works, is it? Those on the outside, as we view them out there, we shouldn't look with such disdain on those that we think are not included in the family or the community of faith. Because at any moment, God could call them into this community and to use them to be a vibrant voice for the gospel, to use them in a powerful way to make the name of Jesus known all over the world. And so this story just highlights the stark lines that we sometimes draw between insiders and outsiders. And we assume that we know who the good guys are in the story. We assume we know the kind of people God wants to use and the kind of people that he is just totally rejecting. And the story of Rahab and Achan shows us that sometimes there's this reversal of fortunes. It's not our past. It's not our present status. It is our ongoing faithfulness to God and our willingness to trust and follow him that determines our standing before God. For those who are insiders, it's a wake-up call to stay faithful. For those who feel like you're an outsider, it's a message of hope that you too can be included, that there's nothing that will permanently separate you from being included in the people of God. You too have the opportunity to come in and be part of a community of faith, to be loved, to be accepted, to be valued, to be lifted up out of the obscurity of your life, to be cherished by a community of faith. So there is both a warning and a message of hope in the story of Achan in Joshua 7 and Rahab in Joshua 2. I hope that you've been encouraged by our study tonight. I want to invite you this Sunday for Father's Day. We've got One by One leading worship for us at both services. We've got a whole lot of donuts that we're ordering. We're going to be blessing the dads here and sharing a message about Genesis 3 and the way that the human heart sometimes looks to all of the wrong things in the world to find happiness and fulfillment, and how we can turn to God instead to find deep satisfaction for our heart's desires. So join us at 9 or 10:30 a.m. this coming Sunday here at Westside. We love you. We hope that you're having a great week, and we hope to see you